Hello everyone, this is John Mark Johnson Jr. again, and have a few thoughts to share with you folks. As it turns out, I was going through my YouTube feed again and looking at the homepage and all the other things that come through YouTube, and saw some more videos by ChickTracts, the KJV only group. There's various KJV only groups, but they're one of them. And I've listened to several other movies now, and they're absolutely hilarious to watch. They're absolutely just mind-boggling in the sense that they cannot get almost any iota of history correct. They have so many theories and conspiracies and little pictures that Daniels holds up, but they don't have a whole lot of actual historical information or core sources in the places where they need them. What they have is a particular narrative, and they have some sources that they fit into the narrative, but they don't actually have a complete history. They don't actually look at the complete history for what it is. And because of that, they wind up making some really, 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 to be nice, I'll say, unfortunate statements, maybe would be a nice way to say that. Not, to be a little bit more blunt, it's more like completely ridiculous statements, but we'll be nice and say unfortunate statements. But what I wanted to particularly address in this one, because they cover so much stuff and they talk about so many different things that if you started trying to refute every error that they have, you're going to be there forever. But some simple ones that I've heard that they keep coming back to in quite a few of their movies has to do with the issue of textual footnotes and what effect they have on people's faith, and what was the original intention of the KJV authors, and translators, technically not authors but translators, and then also how the traditional churches, and especially the Catholics, have been dealing with textual criticism and those kinds of things. ChickTracts often claims that the marginal notes that are found in the original King James Bible are completely negligible. In fact, they've gone so far as to say that if the margin has "or" and then this, wherever there's "or," you can just ignore. That's a little saying that they have, the little ditty that they came up with for it. And their arguments is that, there was this translation process that involved all these people, and there were some people who were just stubborn. They kept saying, no, it should be translated this way, no, it should be translated. When everybody else in the group wanted it translated another way, they kept being stubborn and saying it should be translated this way. So they put a little "or" statement in there for those people. And because of that, because it's just one person here and there, you can just ignore it, because it's not the main text. That's basically the argument that is made on ChickTracts videos fairly frequently. Well, the problem with that is that history actually records what the KJV translators were intending with those marginal notes. Was it just to satisfy this one translator who just wanted it translated that way, or was there something else at work? Well, the KJV translators, this is my facsimile edition of the KJV, by the way. Some people find it a little strange that someone like me, who is not a KJV onlyist, actually owns a KJV, and a KJV facsimile at that. But yes, I'm very well aware of it, and I actually enjoy it a lot. It's actually a very nice text. Very, very, very nice text. If you ever get a chance to get this one, this is a nice printing. This is one of the Oxford editions. Some people argue whether it should be Oxford or Cambridge and all those kinds of things. But it's a very nice edition, if nothing else, even if you don't agree with the particular text that it represents, because different KJVs actually do have slightly different texts. Not in huge things most of the time, but they do have slightly different texts. But the point that we're talking about here is those marginal notes. What is it with the marginal notes? What was the KJV's translators, what was their intentions with them? Was it just to say, okay, here's an alternative from this one translator who's just being really stubborn, or is there more to it? Well, in their own words, this is in the Translators to the Reader, one of the forward articles that originally appeared with the KJV. This is what they say. Therefore, as St. Augustine saith, that variety of translations is profitable for the finding out of the sense of the Scriptures. So diversity of signification and sense in their margin, where the text is not so clear, must needs do good, yea, is necessary, as we are persuaded. Wow, that's a little bit different. They're not saying, oh, this is a negligible reading. That's not what they're saying. What they're saying is that the text is unclear here, and because of it not being unclear, we need to give you the options for what it could also be. That's nowhere near saying, oh, there's this one crazy guy and over here, so wherever there's or, you can just ignore it. It's not that. That's not what they said. And in fact, they did this. They put in the marginal notes and allowed for different signification as an act of counter-Catholicism. It goes on, picking up right where I left off. They said, we know that Sixtus Quintus, which was a council, one of the official church councils, well, kind of official church councils. It wasn't ecumenical, but it was still very Catholic. We know that Sixtus Quintus expressly forbiddeth that any variety of readings of their vulgar edition should be put in the margin, which though it be not altogether the same thing to that which we have in hand, yet it looketh that way. But we thinketh he hath not, speaking of the Pope, that he hath not all his of his own side for his favourers, for his conceit. They that are wise had rather have their judgment at liberty in differences of readings, than to be captivated to one, when it may be the other. What are they saying? What they're saying is that the Catholics will force a particular reading on you based on church tradition. And they don't allow for any particular variety of readings. They don't allow for any discussion. They're not going to allow for any kind of possibility that it could be something other than what their tradition permits it to be. Not that Catholic tradition has actually really defined all that much in Scripture. It really hasn't. Aside from Matthew 16:18, they're not really that dogmatic about most other Scriptures. But still, it was the understanding at the time that the Catholics wanted it to read in a particular way. We're not going to have any marginal notes. We're not going to have any other signification. We're not going to admit that there are any other possibilities here because we want people to believe in a particular way, which is a whole lot like the KJV only position, where we don't really want the original evidence. Instead, what we want is our particular tradition. In the case of the KJV onlyists, it's the KJV only tradition. In the case of the Catholics, it was the Catholic tradition. Go figure. But what is it that the KJV translators themselves said? They said, they that are wise had rather have their judgments at liberty in differences of readings than to be captivated to one, when it may be the other. So why did they put in these marginal notes in the original KJV? Because there's, I think, over 8,000 of them. There's quite a few. Why did they put them in? Because they wanted people to investigate for themselves. They were trying to be honest with the textual information and allow for those kinds of things. That was the exact opposite of what the traditional churches wanted. The traditional churches have never been a very big fan of textual criticism. Hey, by and large. Now, were there some textual critics along the history that were Roman Catholic? Yes. Relatively few and far between, but yes. One of the most notable of them would be Desiderius Erasmus, the one who created the Greek text that basically underlied the Protestant Reformation. He was very much so a Catholic, and he even wrote in favor of transubstantiation in the Mass and things like that. If he were alive today, I would have debated him on that one. I certainly would have taken issue with what he had to say about such things. Okay. But at the same time, he was willing to buck the system and say, no, we want an accurate text. He was very much so a Roman Catholic, but he tried to be as accurate as he could be with the resources that he had available to him, which weren't all that much, but he did the best with what he had. And it wound up proving that there were certain fundamental and pivotal differences between what had come to be accepted in traditional Christianity and what was actually originally written. As ChickTracts rightly points out, one of the big differences was the difference in readings between doing penances and repenting. Turning away from your sin versus making up for your sin. It's a very big theological difference. Huge. And one of the underlying premises of the Protestant Reformation was that as Christians we turn away from our sin, but God is the one who forgives them. He's the one who makes it up, not us, because we can't make it up. Compared to an infinitely pure God, any amount of degradation, any sin, is an infinite offense. You cannot pay that. So we don't pay the penalty, Christ paid the penalty. But we are still to repent. We are still to turn away from our prior life, enabled by the Spirit, of course, made possible by the Spirit, and only by God is as such possible. We are renewed in our minds, as Paul talks about, and through the Spirit we put to death the misdeeds of the body, as it talks about in Romans. But that's not the same thing as doing penances. It's not even close. Very, very, very huge fundamental difference. There's no doubt that there are major differences between the traditional version of the text and what was actually there in the original. And folks like Erasmus wound up being instrumental in pointing that out. And of course, the Roman Catholics didn't like it. And as more and more study was done on the New Testament and how it originally read, the Roman Catholics and also the Eastern Orthodox, their traditional group, they took a lot of issue with what they had to say. And a lot of people aren't all that aware of how big of an issue this was. This whole idea that, Protestants were going out and secular scholars were going out and they were studying these texts for themselves. Open and honest communication with the sources led to some very interesting things, and one of them was the revelation that the traditional versions of the text were wrong. And the traditional churches basically responded by saying, well, we're the church and we decide what the truth is because we're infallible and that's not right. That's essentially what they said. Here's a good example of what I mean. This comes from Moss, written in 1909, in his subarticle, Editions of the Bible, the Critical Text, Part 9. This is a very easily accessible Catholic source that is still considered to be a Catholic source, by the way. I believe you can access it on newadvent.org, I believe, and a few other sources. It's basically a part of the Roman Catholic Encyclopedia, talking about critical texts and those kinds of things. Anyways, this is what he has to say. He says, "It is therefore all the more to be regretted that Nessel's text cannot be recommended to the general Catholic reader." Well, that's definitely different from the narrative that ChickTracts has put out. They keep saying, it's the Jesuits who are behind it. It's the Catholics who are behind these new modern texts like the Nestle Allen texts and the United Bible Society's text. It's the Catholics who are really behind them. Well, when Nestle's text actually was coming out, that's not what the Catholics were saying. They weren't saying this is our text. They were saying it's wrong. They were saying it cannot be recommended to the general Catholic reader. And Moss goes on. He says, not to mention other shortcomings, talking about Nestle's text. It places John 5:4 and 7:53 through 8:11 among the footnotes and represents Mark 16:9 through 20, all very important texts to be aware of and know what the issues are with them, and represents Mark 16:9 through 20 together with an alternative ending of the second gospel as a Western non-interpolation, suggesting that it is an ancient Eastern interpolation of the sacred text, meaning that it was made up. It was not correct. It was not original. That's what Nestle's text says. That's what the Nestle Allen text says. That's what the United Bible Society's 5th edition text says. That's essentially what the Westcott and Hort text says. Pretty much any relatively modern critical edition is going to put that in there one way or the other. These texts are not original. And what's the Catholic response? Well, this is a shortcoming on their point because they're not recognizing the traditional text. They're not upholding the traditional texts that we're used to. And then Moss goes on. He says, now the rules of the new index of the Catholics enumerate with precision those classes of Catholics who may read texts like that of Nestle's. Others must content themselves with one or another of the following editions. What they're saying is basically, if we know that you're really steeped in our faith, we know that you're a good traditional Christian, we'll trust you with reading these other texts. But if not, we don't want to get you to get a hold of one of these modern Protestant perversions. Because you might question the traditional church. You might question whether or not the traditional church got it right, which they didn't. They were wrong. Their versions of the text were wrong. Erasmus proved that, and he was a Roman Catholic. And every scholar since then who's been looking at the traditional form of the text versus the original form of the text has concluded the same thing. And of course the traditional churches don't like it, and the Eastern Orthodox are basically the same on that one. This, for example, Isaiah of Proconicial, pronouncing that wrong, I'm sorry, but Isaiah said in about 2000 on an online article, "Can you tell me which translation the Eastern Orthodox churches uses and why?" He said this, Amazingly, indeed even unbelievably, most modern translators work from an eclectic text or critical text. Does that sound a lot like the KJV onlyists? Eclectic, critical. Sounds a lot like the KJV onlyist to me, doesn't it? But this is not the KJV onlyist who's saying this. This is an Eastern Orthodox guy. He says they work from an eclectic or critical text which draws very heavily from the older codices. And this is where the KJV onlyist comes in and says older doesn't mean better. Older means that it wasn't used as much and therefore it didn't wear out as quickly, which means it was a Bible that was not very well respected in its day, so on and so forth. You don't trust older. Well, that's exactly the same argument that the Eastern Orthodox are making here. And then they go on. This eclectic text is a patchwork of readings from the various manuscripts which differ from each other and from our Byzantine text, or from the Byzantine text, which they claim as their own. And of course, if you know anything about church history, you know that the Byzantine text, which is one of the traditional text forms, the Latin Vulgate is the other major traditional text form, you know that it comes from the Eastern Orthodox. It's their text. It's the one that they preserved. And they preserved it to be traditional. And what I find interesting is that the Eastern Orthodox are actually, in some ways, much more traditional than the Catholics. The Catholics have actually gotten pretty liberal as of late. And it's actually a little hard to pin down Catholic doctrine and theology anymore. They're not exactly, we'll say, as opinionated and as firm as they used to be. They're a little loose now. But the Eastern Orthodox are not that way. For the most part, they're still pretty strong in what they believe. And they are very adamant that the modern texts, which remove passages like John 5:4, call John 7:53 through 8:11 unoriginal, those kinds of things, they don't like those ones. Because those are their traditional texts. They're part of their Byzantine texts that they've preserved. That they believe that the church correctly puts into the Bible. Because after all, their church is infallible, and if that's the text that their church has come to accept, then it must be infallible too. It must be right. So much so that when the Eastern Orthodox decided to make a study Bible for English-speaking people, I have it right here, the Orthodox Study Bible, guess which version of the New Testament they decided to go with? They decided to go with the Byzantine text. They decided to go with the majority text platform, and there's only two basic translations of anything that's even remotely close to a Byzantine text form in English right now. There's the KJV and the NKJV. They're both translated from the same base text as far as the New Testament is concerned. So same underlying text. The only difference between them is, of course, one is a more modern translation with modern verbiage, and it also has some footnotes in it that talk about the differences between it and some of the other text forms. But that's basically it. A little bit more modern translation, up to date on some things, included some more footnotes, but that's pretty much it. And that's the version that they decided to use in their Orthodox Study Bible. This is basically the NKJV, which is, and if you look at some of the older Eastern Orthodox texts and articles that are written in English and those kinds of things, when people ask them, what text should I use for the New Testament, they'll say, use the KJV because it's the one that's the closest to our form in English. It's not exactly the same. There are definitely some differences. 1 John 5:7 comes to mind. 5:7b through 8a in particular, the three heavenly witnesses is not in the Byzantine text, actually. That's a difference. And then, I think John 8:37 is another one that's not in the Byzantine text, and there's a few others. But mostly the KJV and the NKJV, because they both have the same text, are the closest in English that you're going to get to what the Eastern Orthodox will approve of. So who is it that likes the traditional text? Who isn't that wants to have these things that the church added over time? It's the Roman Catholics and it's the Eastern Orthodox. The Protestants and the secular scholars, not so much. They want what was originally given, and it's not what the traditional churches have. Okay, it's very amazing on this one. People come up with all these theories about how the Jesuits, are behind everything, and it's the traditional churches that are trying to get us away from our beloved text. And that's actually the exact opposite. Some people point out, for example, that there was actually a Jesuit who was involved in the creation of more a modern critical text of the Greek New Testament. This here is the Nestle Aland 28th edition, by the way, and you look at the list of people who are involved. Oh, and it should be on here somewhere. Okay. Trying to find one of the forward pages that lists all of the people. And they always bury it in here somewhere. Forgive me, folks. Let's see here. There we go. Come on. Nope, not that one. Well, I'm not finding it in that one. I'll go ahead and use the United Bible Society's 5th edition because it's actually the same translators. I know I can definitely find it in this one. The other one's a little bit harder to find. Greek New Testaments. There we go. Edited by Barbara Aland, Kurt Aland, Johannes Karavidopoulos. Forgive me on that one. I absolutely murder some of these names. Carlo M. Martini and Bruce Metzger. Carlo M. Martini is the Catholic. Okay, Bruce Metzger, by comparison, is an evangelical Christian. So why is it that Carlo M. Martini is here? You have an evangelical Christian like Bruce Metzger, you have Carlo M. Martini, who's Catholic, and they're all involved in making one of these new modern versions. Well, what was the part that Martini played in the text? Well, the ironic thing about it is that before Martini got involved in other people who were in favor of maintaining a certain amount of traditionalism, the critical text actually did not include certain things that they do now. For example, Nestle's text when it first came out didn't include the long ending of Mark 16:9 through 20. Same thing with the Westcott text and other texts like them. They didn't include it. The Catholics got a hold of the text. They started being involved in the committees and the editorial committees that would put together these texts. And guess what they did? They said, well, the evidence is pretty clear that these things are not original, but we would like to have them printed in the main text just because, they have an important role in the history of the text and things like this. And so what you get is kind of a compromise between the two positions. We want it to be accurate, but the Catholics are on the other side saying we want it to be traditional, and so you wind up with a blend between the two, which frankly infuriates me because you have to look in the footnote to see what it's actually supposed to be, but you get a blend between the two. This is the ending of Mark, and I don't know how well it'll show up on the screen there, but on the ending of Mark, it starts out over here with a double bracket. They include the long ending of Mark, but they put the double bracket on there to say, hey, this is actually a part of the original text. So why did you put it in the main text of the edition? Simple. Because we had Catholics on our committee and they wanted to have it in there. And we had other traditionalists on the committee and they wanted to have it in the main text. They admit that it's not original, because the footnote that goes along with it is right there as well, saying this isn't original. These texts omit it, it's not original, but we're going to put it in because it's traditional. And that's the main difference that we have in the two perspectives here. Protestantism, in general, started out with the premise that the traditional churches got it wrong. They were anti-traditional. However, the problem that you run into is that every group is going to wind up developing their own traditions. They're going to assume that, those people over there, they got it wrong, but we couldn't possibly have gotten it wrong. That's natural human nature. People are rather egotistic. And so they're going to say, those people got it wrong, we got it right the first time. And so we're going to keep whatever we got with the first time, with the first separation. The text that was the major first separation away from Roman Catholicism was the Textus Receptus, as far as the New Testament is concerned, and to a large extent the borrowing of the Hebrew Old Testament for Protestant use. Okay, does that? And so that was the first text that a lot of, or at least the textual platform that a lot of Protestants were used to. It became their tradition. They recognized that what the Catholics had was wrong, but they didn't really stop to think all that often to make sure that what they had was right. They basically assumed that they were, to a large extent. Now, there were, of course, Protestants who were not like that. There were actually many Protestants who were not like that. Even, say, people like John Calvin was willing to go back and look at the text and look at textual variants and things like that. Martin Luther actually disputed a lot of the books that even a lot of Protestants now would consider to be fully canonical. He was definitely instrumental in the Protestant evaluation of the Apocrypha as not being canonical. He was certainly instrumental in that, but he would have gone he would go a lot further than a lot of modern Protestants would. And there's people throughout history that would pop up and say, "Hey, are we really right? Is this really correct?" And a lot of times they got shut down by people who wanted their particular tradition, whether it was the Catholics were their tradition or the traditions that the Protestants had come to accept. The state of Bible translations today is a very good reflection of this. Bible translations usually come out as a compromise. Take the NIV, for example. The NIV includes the long ending of Mark. It includes it in double brackets and in italics, but it includes it in the main text. Why? Because traditionalists want to have it in there. And they know they're not going to sell nearly as many editions if they don't have it. If they don't have it, they're not going to make the sales. So they come up with a translation that basically works for both people. It's there in the main text, but it's also put off in brackets with italics so that you know that there's something that's going on with the text, and that way both groups can kind of use it. And that's actually the same idea behind the KJV originally. The KJV was made as a compromise translation between two different factions in the Church of England at the time. There were basically people who were very high church, who were basically as close to Catholicism as you could get without actually having a pope in a lot of respects. Not quite that far, but pretty traditional. And then people who were very anti-traditional, especially like the Puritans, for example. And Puritans wanted a very literal translation and a very accurate translation, whereas the high church Christians wanted a very traditional translation. And what came out of it when everything was said and done is you get the KJV, which stands between the two. It has some traditional verbiage, but it's not completely traditional verbiage. It has aspects that are usable by traditional Christians. For example, the KJV up until 1829 was actually printed with the Apocrypha in it, completely intact. And when it was first came out, it was actually illegal to publish it without the Apocrypha, because that's how the traditional Christians wanted it. But as a compromise to the low church Christians, the Apocrypha was set off, instead of being interspersed throughout the Old Testament like it is in Catholicism. It was a compromise translation. It was made kind of to work on both ends. That's the same thing with a lot of modern Bible translations today. There's still that tension that's going on between traditionalism and historical accuracy. KJV onlyists are groups that are very heavy on the traditional side, their own particular tradition that actually has a lot in common with Roman Catholicism and Eastern Orthodoxy, as we just saw. Eastern Orthodoxy, for example, the only texts that they will advocate in English, as far as major translations that are available, are the NKJV and the original KJV. Those are the ones that they'll advocate for the New Testament right now. Major reason being because the Byzantine text that they use hasn't been really translated into English in any substantial sense yet. So that's what they default to. KJV and KJV, because those are the ones that are closest to their version. And the same thing with the Roman Catholics. The Roman Catholic to have the ending of Mark and those ones. And so they get involved in things like the translation committee not the translation committee, but the editorial committee for United Bible Society's text and S.D. Allen text and those kinds. And they come up with the argument that we should keep this as a part of the main text as of traditional value. We'll put a note saying it's not authentic, but we want to have it in there for tradition. A great tension between the two. And frankly, I get really disappointed with a lot of Christians on this one. That whenever strides are made in Christianity towards the truth, always towards the accuracy of the truth, to what was originally given, and those kinds of things. But a lot of times it stops short and starts to regress because people get caught up in tradition again. We know that those people are wrong, but just simply knowing that those people are wrong doesn't mean that you've done the work to actually figure out what is right. And that problem with KJV onlyists. Really sure that Roman Catholics are wrong. I am with them on that 100%. But the problem is that they're borrowing Roman Catholic arguments pretty often.
and they end up with a text that is very similar to the Roman Catholic text. So, those are some musings, those are some thoughts. I hope it was a useful review. Anyways, for those of you who go with God and be blessed. For those of you who do not know the Christ of history, the God of the Bible, I pray that you would come to a knowledge of the truth.